He thought he'd found the quietest corner of the galaxy, a derelict ship drifting in the void, all empty halls and humming engines, a perfect place for a man to breathe, maybe loot a little tech, and definitely avoid anyone asking for help with chores or conversation. The metal under his boots groaned like an old ship, and the lights flickered overhead in a way that made him nervous enough to glance over his shoulder more than once. He wasn't a hero, far from it, but curiosity had a way of sneaking past caution, especially when it promised a little adventure and maybe a warm meal. That's how he ended up here, alone, in a ship that wasn't really empty at all. The first room he stumbled into seemed simple enough, a narrow corridor lined with small pods that hummed faintly, their lights blinking in soft, inviting patterns. He leaned against the wall, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. And then he saw her, lounging across a bed that looked more like a jungle than furniture, vines curling around the frame, flowers that glowed faintly in the low light, and eyes that were far too intelligent, far too knowing, for a first meeting. She raised a brow at him, one hand idly twining a glowing vine around her fingers, the other resting on her hip in a way that made it obvious she was assessing him as both a guest and a potential project. "Who are you?" he asked, suddenly aware that his voice sounded smaller than usual, almost human in its timidity. "I am Z," she said, voice lilting and musical. "And you are unhygienic." He blinked. "Excuse me?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in judgment. "Your body emits a scent of chaos and disorder. You will wash. You will change. You will cook. All for your own growth." He swallowed, realizing immediately that this was not a polite suggestion. Before he could respond, a second door slid open, and another girl emerged, bouncing slightly as if gravity were optional in her domain. Her hair floated around her head in soft tendrils, and her skin shimmered with a faint iridescence that made her look like she belonged more in a nebula than on a bed. She grinned, tilting her head in a way that made him certain she was both teasing and planning something devious. "I am Lyra," she announced, "and you are mine to entertain." He backed up instinctively, tripping over a vine that Z had left trailing into the corridor. The plant wrapped itself around his ankle with a soft tug, almost apologetic in nature, and he found himself face to face with a small carnivorous bloom that clicked its teeth together, as if in warning. "Okay," he said, heart pounding. "Maybe this ship isn't entirely empty." Before he could fully assess the situation, a third door hissed open, and a girl unlike either of the first two appeared. She moved with grace that suggested both athleticism and intellect, her eyes glowing faintly, scanning him as though she were analyzing a complex problem. "I am Sela," she said calmly, "and your presence here is statistically significant. You will remain until you adapt to our standards." That was the point where the last shred of his confidence fled. 3 alien women, 3 wildly different personalities, and one human who was increasingly aware that he had absolutely no idea how to survive in this environment. He tried to explain, gesturing to the hallway. "Look, I'm just passing through." "I mean, I didn't even..." Lyra interrupted with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes caught in a storm. "Passing through? Oh no, you are here to learn, to grow, to serve, and possibly to suffer." Z's vines adjusted themselves, curling higher, brushing against his shoulders. "Your hygiene must improve. Your diet must adjust. You will do as instructed." And Sela, calm and methodical, added, "Physical conditioning and emotional intelligence are required. Non-compliance is undesirable." He blinked, and then tried to back up. That was the first mistake. His foot caught on a vine, which tugged him forward with alarming speed, flinging him toward a panel on the wall. He twisted, narrowly avoiding a collision, only to be met with Lyra's laugh and a telekinetic nudge that sent him spinning lightly into the VR room next door. The walls lit up with swirling colors, simulations flickering over the surfaces, holographic landscapes that pulsed with enticing, sometimes unnerving imagery. Before he could make sense of it, the room shifted to zero-gravity mode, and suddenly he was bouncing lightly against the walls, landing on a bed that shuddered and hummed in ways that made him realize it had functions he would rather not fully understand in public. "Ah!" he yelped, gripping at the bed frame, as Lyra floated closer, smirking. Relax, she cooed. This is part of your training. Physical endurance, mental focus, and you look very charming when flustered. Z's voice came through from the jungle room, calm but commanding. You will not leave until you have mastered proper comportment and prepared our meals. You will not resist. He glanced at the control panel for the doors and tried to slide it open. It hissed locked. Locked? He said, incredulous. The girls giggled simultaneously, a sound that was somehow both musical and teasing, echoing down the metallic hallways. Yes, Sela said. Leaving is not an option. We will ensure your development is complete. He sighed, realizing that resistance might be as useless as arguing with the laws of physics. The zero-gravity bed shuddered under him as he tried to sit, his body unsure of how to stabilize itself, and Lyra reached out, lightly touching his arm with a practiced precision that made him blush harder than he had in years. Z's vines shifted again, brushing his legs in what seemed like an affectionate reprimand. You will adjust, or you will be uncomfortable. And you'll like it, Lyra added, her grin widening, as though she already knew the answer to that. Sela floated closer, calm and analytical, and touched his shoulder. Resistance is futile, but adaptation is encouraged. You may discover unexpected pleasures. He groaned, realizing with dawning horror and a faint thrill that he wasn't going anywhere. This ship wasn't empty, and these women weren't lonely. They were perfectly, terrifyingly aware of how to keep him exactly where they wanted him, tangled in vines, floating in zero gravity, and blushing at every touch. Somehow, against every instinct he had, he felt a spark of intrigue, a chaotic mix of fear, frustration, and excitement. And as the doors hissed shut behind him, locking for good measure, he knew the first rule of surviving this ship: never underestimate the intentions of 3 alien women who had no idea what it meant to let a human be alone. He could only wonder what kind of absurd, erotic, and humiliating adventures lay ahead, and he had a sinking suspicion he'd enjoy most of them far more than he should. He hadn't even begun to understand the scale of the challenge. Every step he took seemed preordained to lead him into some bizarre trial, and the 3 alien roommates were the architects of his slow, chaotic indoctrination. The jungle bedroom with Z was the first real obstacle. Vines twisted around his ankles as if alive, petals brushing against his skin with a ticklish insistence that made him stumble again and again. Z lounged in the center, humming softly, her glowing eyes following his every motion, critiquing his posture, the way he inhaled, even the angle at which he attempted to step over a particularly aggressive carnivorous plant. You must learn to move with awareness, she said, and when he flinched as a flower snapped at his hand, she tooted. That is poor form. You are not attuned to your environment. Not even slightly. He tried to apologize, but the words were swallowed by the thick air, heavy with scents that were somehow both intoxicating and vaguely alarming. The plant let out a soft hiss as he stepped closer, and he yelped, lunging backward into a dangling vine. She reached out, curling it gently around his wrist as though restraining a child, and whispered, Control your impulses, human. Grace is a virtue. Before he could even consider how he would survive this room, Lyra floated past the doorway into his peripheral vision, her grin widening as the zero-gravity bedroom door slid open. With a swift gesture, he found himself sucked toward it, pulled by some invisible force until he landed awkwardly on the VR floor, immediately immersed in a kaleidoscope of swirling colors, holographic landscapes, and suggestive simulations. He flailed helplessly, trying to regain balance, only for Lyra to laugh and guide him gently into a floating platform, her hands grazing his shoulders in a touch that sent heat curling through him despite the absurdity of the situation. Relax, human, she said, her voice soft but commanding. You are here to learn endurance, mental acuity, and how to please without complaint. He swallowed hard, trying to remind himself that this was a training exercise, not a romantic encounter. Yet every move, every stumble, every accidental touch seemed designed to keep him off balance and flustered. Lyra circled him like a predator, her eyes gleaming, teasing him with gestures that were equal parts instruction and temptation. A misstep sent him crashing into a projection, the digital flowers wrapping around him in what looked like a surreal, erotic hug, and he realized he was completely outmatched. Sela's domain was no less intimidating. The zero-gravity obstacle course, designed to test spatial awareness, agility, and apparently, the limits of his modest dignity, floated before him like a glittering puzzle. Platforms drifted in impossible configurations, walls slid at unpredictable intervals, and Sela's calm voice guided him through each challenge. Balance your weight, predict your trajectory, and remember, every touch has meaning, she said, gliding alongside him in elegant motion. Her hand brushed his as she corrected his grip, sending an unexpected jolt of awareness straight to his core. He gasped, stumbled, and nearly collided with a floating console, but she simply smiled, brushing her fingers across his arm again as if nothing had happened. You are improving. Slowly, but improvement is evident, she murmured. He couldn't tell if he wanted to curse at her or thank her, and the confusion made him even more vulnerable to the slapstick absurdity of the moment. By the time he was back in Z's jungle room, he had already tripped over the same vine 3 times, spilled the bizarre luminescent liquid on his clothes, and managed to anger a plant that snapped at him in a manner that would have been terrifying if it weren't slightly erotic in the way the tendrils brushed against him before recoiling. Z clucked her tongue, tugging a vine gently to steady him, whispering, "Do not resist, human. Resistance only leads to injury, or humiliation. Embrace your role. Learn from it." And as if to underscore her point, Lyra popped her head in from the doorway, grin wide, commenting, "He's learning. Slowly. But amusingly. And charmingly helpless." The culinary challenges came next. The girls insisted he cook alien recipes, each more complicated and absurd than the last. Z handed him a glowing fruit that pulsed with bioluminescent intensity. "Slice carefully," she instructed, "or it will react violently to your incompetence." The fruit snapped slightly when he touched it, releasing a cloud of sparkling spores that made him sneeze, cough, and blink rapidly, all while vines tried to push him back onto the bed for safety. Lyra floated over, her laughter ringing like wind chimes, showing him the correct way to slice with a flick of her wrist. Each accidental slip, each misjudged motion, sent him tumbling, yet somehow, through a series of chaotic accidents, the fruit was perfectly prepared. He felt a brief surge of pride, only to have Sela appear, gliding silently beside him. "Human ingenuity is commendable. Now combine it with sensuality and attentiveness." He blinked. "Sensuality?" "Yes," she said softly, brushing her fingers against his arm, a corrective gesture that sent an involuntary shiver through him. "Every action, even in cooking, must reflect awareness, presence, and intention. This is how you learn intimacy." By the time the day, or whatever counted as day on this drifting ship, had ended, he was covered in glowing juices, tripping over floating vines, and experiencing the most chaotic, confusing, and erotic training regimen of his life. He attempted a tentative escape, slinking toward a control panel that might open a door, only to have the zero-gravity bed shift beneath him, flinging him back into Lyra's waiting arms. "You see," she purred, "attempting to leave only reinforces your attachment." She tugged a vine, pulling him closer. "Embrace it. You are here to grow spiritually, emotionally, and physically." Sela's voice came last, calm, measured, but somehow infinitely more teasing. "Resistance is instructive, but adaptation is pleasurable. You may find yourself enjoying the process." He groaned, realizing that he had no choice, and perhaps, that some part of him didn't want to escape. The chaos of the jungle, the absurdity of VR, the zero-gravity training, the constant teasing and touch, it was exhausting, overwhelming, and strangely intoxicating. The 3 of them, impossible as they were forcing him into a world where every action had meaning, every stumble was instruction, and every accidental brush of skin carried both comedic and erotic weight. And as he collapsed, breathless, into a tangle of vines and holographic projections, he knew one unshakable truth: the ship wasn't just a trap, it was an education, and somehow, horribly, magnificently, he was learning fast. He had begun to understand a terrifying truth. This ship was not designed for escape, and every clever idea he came up with to regain freedom only made the situation exponentially worse. He thought he had a plan, a simple, human-sized plan: slip past the doors while they were distracted, use the ship's corridors to reach an escape pod, and vanish. Simple, right? Of course it wasn't. As soon as he crept toward the corridor, he felt a subtle tug, like invisible hands guiding him off course, and before he knew it, the zero-gravity bed he had collapsed onto earlier started floating toward the VR room, nudging him in the direction of Lyra's grinning face. She hovered just inside the doorway, arms crossed, eyes gleaming. "Going somewhere?" she asked lightly. The air seemed to pulse around her, and suddenly the holographic simulations shifted, filling the corridor with swirling, psychedelic landscapes. One moment he was stepping on solid ground, the next he was bouncing gently between glowing platforms, VR-generated flowers brushing against him as though they were testing his reflexes. He flailed, trying to maintain balance, only to have a vine from Z's jungle slide around his leg, tugging him backward. Z appeared at the edge of the holographic field, her glowing eyes narrowing with what he swore was mild disapproval. "Running is unnecessary," she said, her tone calm but heavy with authority. "You will learn to navigate obstacles, both physical and emotional. Attempting to leave now will only cause embarrassment." He groaned audibly. "Emotional embarrassment?" "Yes," Sela said, stepping from the shadows of the zero-gravity room with her usual calm, elegant precision. "Resistance highlights weaknesses. Every misstep is an opportunity for correction and growth." His attempts to escape were continually foiled in absurd ways. He tried sliding along a maintenance panel, thinking he could bypass the obstacles, only to trigger a sequence that sent the VR projections into overdrive. Suddenly, the corridor was filled with floating platforms that glowed hot pink, trails of light following his every movement, and holographic butterflies that insisted on landing on his shoulders and hair. Each butterfly's wings brushed against his skin in ways that made him hyper-aware of his body, leaving him both frustrated and awkwardly flustered. Meanwhile, Lyra floated around him with enviable grace, lightly touching his arm to correct his balance, each touch causing a jolt of heat he was powerless to control. "You see," she said softly, "this is how awareness is cultivated. Every movement, every contact, every blush teaches you more than resistance ever could." She wasn't idle either. The vines in her jungle room reached through the corridors, seeking him out with a mischievous intelligence. One vine wrapped around his waist and lifted him slightly off the floor, spinning him just enough to ensure he bumped into a holographic flower that clung to his chest. He flailed, trying to disentangle himself, but the plant seemed to enjoy the struggle, tugging him gently yet firmly with every effort he made. By the time he stumbled into Sela's zero-gravity obstacle course, his limbs were trembling, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and holographic pollen, and his dignity hanging by a thin, tenuous thread. Sela guided him through the course with uncanny patience, her hands brushing against his back, his shoulders, correcting every movement in ways that made his chest tighten and his stomach coil with both embarrassment and something dangerously close to desire. "Precision," she murmured, "attention to detail, an awareness of how your body responds to stimuli." He tried to protest, to explain that he had human limitations, that he wasn't built for floating through multiple hazard rooms while 3 alien women corrected his every motion, but every word was swallowed by the chorus of teasing laughter. Lyra's voice floated in from the VR projection, melodic and wickedly amused. "You're learning," she said, "and enjoying it more than you realize." He groaned and attempted yet another escape, ducking beneath a floating platform, only for a vine from Z to flick him into the air. The trajectory sent him tumbling through a VR waterfall, holographic droplets sticking to his skin in ways that were absurdly intimate. He landed in a soft heap on the zero-gravity bed, only to be caught by Lyra's arms again, her body pressing against his lightly as she steadied him. His face burned, and he realized with helpless amusement that his escape attempts had become training exercises in erotic humiliation. The culinary challenges weren't over, either. After the obstacle course, he was forced to prepare an alien dish that involved juggling glowing orbs, stirring semi-solid luminescent pastes with precise hand movements, and incorporating scents that triggered minor hallucinations. Z hovered nearby, issuing critiques with a sharpness that left him dizzy and flustered. Incorrect pressure. Your stir is sloppy. The aroma is misaligned with intention. As if on cue, Lyra floated over, her fingers brushing against his as she corrected his grip, a subtle, teasing intimacy that made him shiver involuntarily. Seela's calm voice reminded him that each motion was not just culinary, but a test of presence, awareness, and sensual responsiveness. The absurdity of the situation, combined with the erotic undertones, left him overwhelmed, juggling tasks, body awareness, and the constant brush of alien hands. By mid-cycle, he was dizzy, flushed, and breathless, but strangely aware that he had begun to anticipate these interactions. He tried to escape one final time, slipping toward the door, but the zero-gravity bed shifted once more, nudging him back toward Lyra, Z, and Seela, each waiting with an expression that combined amusement, challenge, and expectation. He sighed, realizing in a mix of exasperation and reluctant thrill that he was caught. He was utterly at their mercy, and the more he struggled, the more he was reminded that the girls weren't cruel. They were instructive, mischievous, and teasing, guiding him through a chaotic curriculum of bodily awareness, erotic tension, and absurd slapstick. Finally, he collapsed in a heap, breathless, entangled in holographic flowers, vines, and the zero-gravity bed, staring up at the girls. Their expressions were impossible to read, a mixture of smug satisfaction and amusement, as if they knew exactly how much he was struggling and yet delighted in every second of it. His chest heaved, not just from the physical exertion, but from the realization that he had been drawn into a world where every mistake was a lesson, every touch a correction, and every moment of embarrassment was a strange, intoxicating pleasure. And somewhere deep inside, against every instinct to escape, a part of him admitted something he would never say out loud. He was learning to enjoy it. By the time he opened his eyes again, he realized the struggle wasn't over, it had transformed. No longer was he simply trying to survive the absurdity of zero-gravity beds, carnivorous plants, or holographic mischief. Now he was learning to navigate it with a combination of wit, humor, and begrudging cooperation. The girls were everywhere at once, Z's vines curling through the hallway to tug him gently toward her glowing jungle, Lyra floating alongside him in a teasingly intimate orbit, and Seela gliding through the zero-gravity obstacle course with that calm, insidious precision that made him hyper-aware of his every move. He realized, with a mixture of dread and thrill, that his previous resistance had only prolonged the chaos. Perhaps the only way forward was to embrace it. He began small, moving carefully to avoid tripping over vines or bumping into floating platforms, balancing precariously as holographic flowers brushed against his skin. Lyra's laughter followed him like a melody, teasing and soft, encouraging him even as she continued her hands-on guidance. Every accidental brush of her fingers against his arm or shoulder sent sparks of awareness through him, jolts of embarrassment and forbidden amusement mingling in equal measure. He caught himself smiling despite the absurdity, realizing that part of his human stubbornness was giving way to something else, acceptance, if not enjoyment. She watched from the edge of her jungle, vines adjusting to keep him in a defined path, critiquing his posture and stance. "Balance is still imperfect," she said, voice smooth and commanding, "but improvement is evident. Your body responds in ways that indicate potential for refinement and pleasure." He shivered, aware of her words' dual meaning, and tried to formulate a polite protest. Of course, every protest seemed to invite laughter from one of the others. Seela appeared beside him silently, almost like she had emerged from the shadows themselves. "Coordination requires trust," she said, brushing her hand across his back to correct a lean he hadn't realized he'd adopted. "Trust fosters intimacy, and intimacy fosters understanding. If you resist, you fail in all three." He swallowed hard, realizing that she wasn't just lecturing, she was demonstrating. Each correction, each subtle touch, made him more aware of his own body, more conscious of every motion, and increasingly entangled in the chaotic affection of three alien women. The zero-gravity bed shifted again, nudging him toward Lyra, who caught him with an elegant precision that left his chest tight, cheeks flushed, and thoughts scrambling. "You're finally learning," she whispered, the words trailing along his skin in a teasingly literal sense. The culinary challenge came next, as usual. The glowing orbs of alien ingredients hovered before him, humming softly, waiting for his hands to take command. He moved with a precision that surprised even him, slicing, stirring, and balancing flavors while avoiding hallucination-inducing spills. Lyra floated over, correcting the tiniest mistakes, her fingers grazing his in a way that sent shivers through him. Z adjusted vines that threatened to knock his preparations into chaos, muttering comments that were somehow both critique and encouragement. Even Sela offered subtle pointers, her calm touch guiding his wrist in a sweep of delicate motion. He found, with amazement, that he was performing well, not perfectly, perhaps, but better than he ever expected. And then came the moment of revelation. He had been trying to escape, trying to maintain some shred of control, and now he realized he didn't want to. Not entirely. The girl's chaotic, teasing, instructive methods had worked. He was learning, adapting, thriving in their absurd household. The zero-gravity, the holograms, the vines, the culinary trials, they had transformed him. A human who had once stumbled and panicked was now moving with awareness, responding to their touch, balancing chaos with humor, and even enjoying the erotic tension that had once left him flustered and overwhelmed. His final attempt at an escape was executed with careful precision. He slid toward the control panel, hands steady, mind focused, and with a subtle flick, he triggered a sequence that he hoped would unlock a door. But of course, the girls anticipated him. The VR projections shifted into a surreal disco of lights, Z's vines twining playfully around him, Lyra floating directly into his path with a teasing grin, and Sela gliding alongside, offering calm, measured corrections. Every attempt at cleverness was met with simultaneous chaos and pleasure. He sighed, exhaling in resignation that was oddly satisfying. Okay, I get it," he muttered, cheeks heating. "I'm not leaving. I'll play along." Their laughter was immediate, musical, triumphant. Lyra pressed close, brushing a finger along his arm with the delicate precision of a sculptor, and whispered, "Finally, comprehension." Z tugged gently at a vine, pulling him closer, murmuring, "Acceptance is the first step to mastery and enjoyment." Sela's touch was softer, almost imperceptible, but no less powerful. "You are learning, not just survival, but connection. Connection leads to understanding, and understanding to pleasure." He felt himself blush and groan simultaneously, a tangle of confusion, embarrassment, and undeniable thrill. The three of them closed in, surrounding him, teasing, correcting, guiding, laughing. For the first time, he realized that his role wasn't just to survive, it was to participate, to embrace the chaos, the erotic tension, and the absurdity that defined life on this empty ship that had turned out to be anything but empty. And as he stood, tangled in vines, bathed in holographic light, floating precariously on the zero-gravity bed, he knew something had shifted. The chaos was no longer terrifying. It was exhilarating. The teasing, the touches, the constant, impossible instruction, it was intoxicating. He was learning, adapting, enjoying, and in a strange, chaotic way, thriving. He looked at the three of them, each impossible, chaotic, radiant in her own way, and realized he had not only survived, but he had become part of this bizarre, erotic, and utterly ridiculous household. The thought made him grin, helpless and happy, knowing he would never leave, because he didn't want to. Not really. The adventure, the erotic tension, the slapstick chaos, the alien romance, it was his life now. And somehow, he was exactly where he was meant to be,